The floorboards of the old house groaned under the weight of secrets. In the heart of rural Arkansas, in a year choked by the dust of a new century, the Blackwood boarding house stood as a beacon of supposed respectability. Its whitewashed walls gleamed under the oppressive southern sun, a stark contrast to the darkness that festered within. For the weary traveler, the transient worker, it promised a hot meal and a soft bed. But for an unknown number of men, it was a final destination. A place where their journeys ended not with a peaceful rest, but with a horrifying, unthinkable transformation. Our story begins not with a disappearance, but with a discovery. A small, almost insignificant object found by a man who was paying far too much attention for his own good. It was a tooth, a human molar, stained dark with age wedged deep between two floorboards in a second-story room. It was found by a young writer named Thomas Riley, a man who had come to the town of Havenwood seeking solitude, but would instead uncover a macabre legacy that the town had tried to bury. He thought it was an anomaly, a relic from a previous tenant, perhaps lost in a scuffle or pulled in a fit of drink-fueled agony. He had no way of knowing that he was sleeping in a room that was not just a temporary shelter, but a larder. He couldn't comprehend that the very floor beneath him was a part of a forbidden culinary machine, a system of such profound evil that its truth would shatter the sanity of all who uncovered it. The tooth was the first loose thread in a tapestry of horror, a small clue to a cold case so disturbing, it was intentionally erased from the annals of local history. The year is 1905. The Gilded Age is fading, giving way to the Progressive Era, a time of supposed enlightenment and industrial marvel. But in the isolated pockets of the Ozark Mountains, time moves differently. Here, in towns like Havenwood, progress is a distant rumor, whispered on the winds that carry the scent of pine and damp earth. Havenwood was a town built on timber and tradition, a place where everyone knew their neighbor's business, or so they thought. It was a community bound by shared hardship and a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders. At the center of its modest social web was Elspeth Blackwood, a widow in her late 50s. She was the proprietor of the only boarding house in town. To the townsfolk, Mrs. Blackwood was a pillar of the community, pious, kind, and possessed of an almost supernatural culinary talent. Her stews were legendary, her roasts the talk of the county. Men who worked the railroads, the timber mills, or sold their wares from town to town all sought lodging at her establishment. It was known for its clean rooms, its firm but fair rules, and above all, its unforgettable meals. The food was rich, hearty, and inexplicably satisfying. It was the kind of meal that settled deep in a man's bones, warding off the chill of a lonely night on the road. What no one questioned was the source of her ingredients. In a town this small, this isolated, where did she procure such fine, tender cuts of meat, day after day, week after week? The answer was a secret she kept locked away, a forbidden knowledge hidden behind a pleasant smile and the comforting aroma of her kitchen. It was a secret that was walking, talking, and sleeping under her very own roof. Thomas Riley arrived in Havenwood on the afternoon train, a cloud of steam and coal dust announcing his entry into a world he did not understand. A writer from St. Louis, he sought refuge from the city's clamor, hoping the quietude of the Ozarks would cure his writer's block. The Blackwood boarding house was recommended to him by the station master, described as the finest lodgings a man could ask for. From the moment he saw it, the house seemed perfect. A two-story Victorian with a welcoming porch and meticulously tended flower beds. Elspeth Blackwood greeted him at the door, her eyes kind, her smile disarming. She was a picture of grandmotherly warmth, her hands dusted with flour, an apron tied neatly around her waist. She showed him to his room on the second floor, the very room where he would later find the tooth. It was simple, clean, with a window overlooking the dense forest that encroached upon the town from all sides. He settled in, the scent of a simmering stew already drifting up from the kitchen, a comforting promise of the hospitality he had been seeking. That first evening, he sat at the long communal dining table with 4 other boarders, a railroad surveyor, 2 loggers, and a traveling salesman selling patent medicines. They were rough, weary men, their faces etched with the hardships of their trades. Yet, as Mrs. Blackwood served the meal, a reverent silence fell over the room. The stew was magnificent. The meat was tender, falling apart at the touch of a fork, bathed in a thick, savory gravy that hinted at spices Thomas couldn't quite name. It was, without a doubt, the best meal he had ever eaten. He ate until he was full, and then he ate some more. It was only later, as he lay in bed, that a strange, unsettling thought crept into his mind. The meat had a flavor, a texture that was both deeply familiar and yet disturbingly alien. The days in Havenwood slipped into a slow, monotonous rhythm. Thomas would spend his mornings writing, the afternoons walking through the woods, and the evenings in the company of the other boarders. The house was always quiet, impeccably clean. Mrs. Blackwood moved through its halls like a phantom. Her presence felt more than seen, in the freshly made beds, the polished wood, and the ever-present aroma of cooking. It was on his fourth day that Thomas noticed the first irregularity. The salesman, a boisterous man named Arthur Finch, was absent from breakfast. The night before, Finch had been in high spirits, boasting of a large sale he had made in the next county. He had spoken of heading west at first light. When Thomas inquired about him, Mrs. Blackwood offered a simple, placid explanation. "Mr. Finch received a telegram late last night," she said, not looking up from the bacon she was frying. "An urgent family matter. He had to depart before dawn. Paid his bill and left in quite a hurry." It seemed plausible enough. The life of a traveling man was unpredictable, yet something felt wrong. Finch had left behind his entire case of medicines, the very tools of his trade, sitting by the front door. Why would a man in such a hurry forget the most important instrument of his livelihood? Thomas pointed this out, a flicker of journalistic curiosity overriding his natural reluctance to pry. Mrs. Blackwood's smile didn't waver. "Oh, the poor man was so flustered, he must have forgotten it. I'll hold on to it for him. I'm sure he'll realize his mistake and send for it soon." The explanation was smooth, too smooth. It was the first time Thomas felt a cold sliver of doubt, a tiny crack in the perfect facade of the Blackwood boarding house. A man had vanished, and the only witness was a woman whose kindness suddenly felt rehearsed. That evening, the main course was a magnificent roast. Mrs. Blackwood presented it with her usual pride, the dark, glistening meat surrounded by roasted potatoes and carrots. She called it her special pork roast, a recipe passed down through her family. The remaining boarders ate with their usual voracious appetite, praising her cooking between mouthfuls. Thomas, however, found his appetite had waned. The image of Arthur Finch's forgotten case of medicines lingered in his mind. He watched Mrs. Blackwood as she carved the roast, her movements precise and practiced. There was an efficiency to her that was almost surgical. He looked at the meat on his plate, its texture finer than any pork he had ever seen. He took a bite. The flavor was rich, intensely savory, with a subtle sweetness that was both alluring and deeply unsettling. As he ate, he found himself thinking of Finch again, of the man's fleshy, portly build. A macabre, intrusive thought wormed its way into his consciousness, a thought so horrifying he immediately tried to banish it. It was absurd, a product of a writer's overactive imagination. This was a kindly old woman, a devout churchgoer. Such things were the stuff of penny dreadfuls, not the quiet reality of a town like Havenwood. He forced himself to finish his meal, to compliment his hostess on her skill. But as he went to bed that night, the taste of the roast lingered on his palate, and the forbidden question echoed in the silent darkness of his room. What, exactly, had he just eaten? The house seemed to have its own secrets, and the more Thomas looked, the more he felt he was on the verge of a truly disturbing revelation. Disappearance of Arthur Finch gnawed at Thomas. The official story was that he had left. The evidence, his forgotten case, suggested otherwise. Thomas decided to do some discreet digging. He began by walking into town to the telegraph office. He asked the clerk, a wiry man with nervous eyes, if a message had come in for Mr. Finch 2 nights prior. The clerk checked his logbook meticulously. "No, sir," he said, shaking his head. "Nothing for a Finch, not in the last week." The lie was now confirmed. Mrs. Blackwood had invented the telegram. This was no longer just a strange inconsistency. It was a deliberate deception. Why would she lie? The question spun in Thomas's mind, each potential answer darker than the last. He felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that he had stumbled into something far more sinister than a simple case of a tenant skipping out on his bill. His journalistic instincts, long dormant, were now fully awake. He was no longer just a writer seeking peace. He was an investigator, a lone seeker of a truth that felt increasingly dangerous. That afternoon, while Mrs. Blackwood was in town buying supplies, Thomas took a risk. He slipped into Finch's now vacant room. It was spotlessly clean. The bed made, the floor swept. It was as if the man had never been there. But Thomas was looking for what couldn't be seen. He got on his hands and knees, running his fingers over the floorboards. Near the window, he felt a small, dark stain, one that had been scrubbed at but not entirely removed. It was faint, almost invisible, but it was there. And then he saw it, a glint of brass under the heavy wooden wardrobe. He dragged the furniture aside, his heart pounding. There, lying flat against the floor, was a single cufflink, engraved with the initials AF. Arthur Finch had not left in a hurry. He had vanished from this very room. The discovery of the cufflink shifted Thomas's fear into a grim certainty. He was living in a house where people disappeared. He now looked at the other boarders, the two silent loggers, the quiet railroad surveyor, in a new light. Were they future victims? Or were they somehow in on the secret? Their faces were unreadable, their conversations limited to grunts and brief comments about the weather or the quality of the food. They seemed oblivious, content to exist within the simple cycle of work, eat, and sleep that Mrs. Blackwood provided. Thomas felt utterly alone, trapped in a web of polite hospitality that seemed to conceal a macabre abyss. His nights became sleepless. Every creak of the old house sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking figure. The aroma from the kitchen, once so comforting, now turned his stomach. He began to subtly refuse the meat dishes, pleading a sensitive stomach and sticking to bread and vegetables. Mrs. Blackwood would look at him with a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it concern or suspicion? He couldn't tell. Her placid demeanor had become a terrifying mask. He knew he needed to find more proof, something undeniable that he could take to the town sheriff. But what could he find? The house was kept unnervingly clean. Mrs. Blackwood was a meticulous housekeeper. There were no obvious clues, no overt signs of violence. The evil here was subtle, efficient, and horrifyingly domestic. It was an evil that wore an apron and hummed quietly while it worked in the kitchen, preparing meals that were part of a forbidden, ongoing crime. He realized the most damning secrets were likely not in plain sight, but hidden away, in the places Mrs. Blackwood kept locked. And there was one place in particular that drew his attention, the heavy, bolted door that led to the cellar. The cellar door was at the end of a dark hallway off the kitchen. It was made of thick oak, bound with iron straps, and secured with a heavy deadbolt to which only Mrs. Blackwood had the key. She always made a point of explaining that the cellar was prone to dampness and pests, and that it was best kept sealed for the preservation of her canned goods. It was a reasonable explanation, but in the growing atmosphere of dread that now permeated Thomas's world, it sounded like another carefully constructed lie. A strange, faint smell sometimes emanated from beneath the door, a coppery metallic scent, mixed with the earthy odor of damp soil. Mrs. Blackwood would dismiss it as the smell of the root vegetables she stored there. But to Thomas, it smelled vaguely of a butcher shop, a scent that triggered a primal sense of revulsion. He became obsessed with that door. What was she hiding down there? Was it a storeroom for her unspeakable ingredients? A makeshift tomb? The thought sent a chill down his spine. He knew that getting into that cellar was the key. He had to see what was behind that door. But how? Mrs. Blackwood guarded the key with a jealousy that bordered on paranoia. It never left the chain she wore around her waist. Trying to take it from her was unthinkable. He would have to find another way. As he contemplated his next move, he felt the house itself watching him. The portraits of Mrs. Blackwood's ancestors on the walls seemed to follow him with their eyes. The floorboards seemed to whisper warnings as he walked. He was no longer just a tenant. He was an intruder, an enemy within the gates, and he had the terrifying feeling that Mrs. Blackwood knew it. Days turned into a week. Thomas maintained his facade of the quiet writer, all the while observing, waiting for an opportunity. The atmosphere in the boarding house grew heavier, more oppressive. One of the loggers, a young man named Billy, began to complain of feeling unwell. He was pale and listless, his usually hearty appetite gone. Mrs. Blackwood fussed over him, preparing him special broths and teas. She insisted he stay in his room and rest. For 2 days, no one saw Billy. Mrs. Blackwood would carry trays up to his room, her expression one of deep concern. "The poor boy has a terrible fever," she would tell the other boarders at dinner time. "He needs his rest." On the 3rd day, she announced that Billy's brother had arrived from a neighboring logging camp to take him home to recover. It all happened very early. In the morning, she explained, while everyone else was asleep. She had helped the brother carry Billy out to a wagon. Once again, a man had disappeared from the house under circumstances that were just plausible enough to deflect immediate suspicion. But Thomas knew it was another lie. He had been awake most of that night, his nerves on edge, his window open to the cool night air. He had heard no wagon, no voices, no footsteps carrying a sick man down the stairs. He had heard only the sighing of the wind and the rhythmic, unsettling sound of a cleaver striking a wooden block, coming from the kitchen in the dead of night. The sound had continued for over an hour, a steady, methodical chopping that was profoundly disturbing. The next evening, Mrs. Blackwood served a new dish she called veal stew. It was delicious. The other boarders ate it without a second thought. Thomas felt bile rise in his throat. The disappearance of Billy, the logger, was the final catalyst. Thomas knew he could no longer wait. He had to get help. He packed the cufflink, his only piece of tangible evidence, into his pocket and walked directly to the office of the town sheriff, a man named Brody. Sheriff Brody was a large, lethargic man whose uniform was stretched tight over a prominent belly. His office smelled of stale coffee and cheap cigars. Thomas laid out his story as calmly and logically as he could. He spoke of Arthur Finch's sudden departure, the forgotten case, the lie about the telegram, and the discovery of the cufflink. He spoke of Billy's supposed illness and the phantom wagon in the night. He spoke of the strange, methodical chopping sounds from the kitchen. The sheriff listened with an expression of weary patience, his eyes half closed. When Thomas was finished, Brody leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest. "Son," he said, his voice a low drawl, "you've got a fine imagination. I'll give you that. You writers are all the same." He dismissed the cufflink as something Finch could have dropped at any time. He explained that transient folk were unreliable and often left without a word. As for Mrs. Blackwood, he scoffed at the very idea. "Elspeth Blackwood, she's a God-fearing woman, a widow who's done nothing but good for this town. You're spinning ghost stories about her famous cooking, is that it?" Thomas insisted, his voice rising with desperation, but the sheriff waved him away. "There's no crime here," Brody stated flatly. "Just a city boy who ain't used to country ways. Go on back to your boarding house and finish your book, and I'd advise you not to be spreading such slanderous tales about one of my citizens." Thomas left the office feeling a cold, profound despair. The law would not help him. The town was blind to the evil in its midst. He was completely, terrifyingly on his own. Defeated and exposed, Thomas returned to the boarding house. His visit to the sheriff had been a foolish gamble. He now feared that Brody might mention his slanderous tales to Mrs. Blackwood. He had not only failed to get help, but he had likely alerted his enemy. He had to get out. His plan was simple. He would pack his bag in the middle of the night, slip out of the house, and walk the 10 miles to the next town to catch a train, leaving Havenwood and its dark secrets behind him forever. He spent the afternoon in his room, pretending to write, his ears straining for any sign that Mrs. Blackwood's demeanor towards him had changed. At dinner, she was exactly as she always was, pleasant, smiling, and attentive. She served a simple meal of chicken and dumplings and seemed not to notice as Thomas once again picked at his food. But as she cleared the plates, her eyes met his for a brief moment. In their depths, he saw not kindness, but a flat, cold appraisal. It was a look one might give to livestock. In that instant, he knew she was aware of his suspicion. The pretense was over, even if neither of them acknowledged it. The house, which had once felt like a trap, now felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. He knew he might not survive the night. He had to act, and he had to act fast. His plan to leave was no longer just about escape. It was about survival. The disturbing story of this place was one he might not live to tell. And as the sun set, casting long, menacing shadows through his window, he began to understand the true, horrifying nature of the curse that haunted this house. If you find these descents into the forgotten corners of history compelling, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. The stories we unearth are often forbidden for a reason, and by joining us, you ensure these chilling accounts are not lost to the silence. The tale of the Blackwood boarding house only grows more macabre from here. That night, Thomas didn't undress for bed. He sat in a chair by the window, his packed bag at his feet, waiting for the house to fall silent. He listened as the remaining boarders shuffled off to their rooms, the floorboards creak. In their passage, he heard Mrs. Blackwood moving about downstairs, the clinking of dishes being washed, the familiar routine of her closing up for the night. Finally, the last lamp was extinguished, plunging the house into a deep, rural darkness, punctuated only by the sliver of moonlight filtering through the trees. He waited another hour, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The silence was absolute, profound. It was time. He carefully lifted his bag, took a deep breath, and opened his door, wincing at the slight creak it made. He stepped into the hallway, a corridor of impenetrable blackness. He moved by touch, his hands sliding along the wall, taking one slow, deliberate step at a time. Each groan of the house under his weight sounded like a cannon shot in the stillness. He reached the top of the stairs and paused, listening. Nothing. He began his descent, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. He was halfway down when he heard it, a sound from the kitchen below. A soft, rhythmic scraping noise. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. He froze, every muscle tensed. Someone was awake, and they were in the kitchen, right by the back door, his intended escape route. Thomas flattened himself against the wall on the staircase, peering into the inky blackness below. The scraping sound continued, methodical and unnerving. Who was in the kitchen at this hour? A sliver of moonlight cut through the kitchen window, partially illuminating the scene. He could just make out a figure standing at the large wooden butcher's block in the center of the room. It was Mrs. Blackwood. Her back was to him. She was wearing a nightgown, her gray hair undone and falling over her shoulders. She was sharpening a knife. Not a small paring knife, but a large, heavy-bladed cleaver. The scraping sound was the steel blade being drawn slowly, deliberately across a sharpening stone. Scrape, pause, scrape. The sound was hypnotic, terrifying. It was the sound of preparation. Why would she be sharpening a cleaver in the middle of the night? The image of the veal stew served after Billy's disappearance flashed in his mind. The methodical chopping he had heard. This was the instrument. This was her tool. A wave of nausea and terror washed over him. His escape route through the back door was blocked. His only other option was the front door, but the lock was old and notoriously loud. He would never make it out without alerting her. He was trapped. He slowly, silently backed up the stairs, his mind racing. He couldn't leave, but he couldn't stay. He returned to his room and quietly locked the door, jamming a chair under the knob for good measure. He was a prisoner. He sat on his bed, listening to the relentless, rhythmic scraping from the kitchen below, a sound that promised a horrifying future. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was preparing for her next guest, and he was the only one left. The long night passed in a state of hypervigilant terror. The scraping finally stopped around 3 in the morning, replaced by a silence that was somehow even more menacing. Thomas did not sleep. At first light, he heard Mrs. Blackwood moving about, her footsteps light, her movements unhurried, as if the previous night's macabre ritual had been nothing more than mundane housework. He heard her go out the back door, likely to tend her garden. This was his chance. He knew he couldn't escape the house, not yet, but he could find the proof he needed, the one thing that would force Sheriff Brody to act. He had to get into the cellar. He crept downstairs. The kitchen was empty, the cleaver nowhere in sight. The cellar door stood as impassive and formidable as ever. He examined the lock. It was old, a simple warded lock. Growing up in the city, he had learned a few unsavory skills, including a rudimentary ability to pick locks. He retrieved a piece of wire from his writing kit and knelt before the door. His hands trembled, making the delicate work nearly impossible. He could hear Mrs. Blackwood outside, humming a hymn as she worked among her roses. The gentle, pious sound was a horrifying counterpoint to what he was doing. He worked the wire into the lock, feeling for the tumblers. Minutes felt like hours. He heard her footsteps on the back porch. She was coming back inside. In a final, desperate move, he gave the wire a sharp twist. There was a dull, metallic click. The lock had opened. He didn't have time to think. He pulled the door open just enough to slip through and closed it silently behind him, plunging himself into a cool, damp darkness. The air in the cellar was thick and cloying, a nauseating miasma of damp earth, mildew, and something else. The coppery, metallic smell he had noticed before was overpowering down here. It was the smell of old blood. He fumbled in his pocket for a match, his hands shaking so violently it took 3 tries to strike it. The small flame flickered to life, casting dancing. Monstrous shadows on the stone walls. The cellar was larger than he had imagined. One side was lined with shelves of canned goods, pickles, jams, and vegetables, a perfect portrait of domestic industry. But the other side was a scene from a nightmare. The flame illuminated a large, stained wooden table, much like the butcher's block upstairs, only larger and scarred with countless deep cuts. Above it, hanging from the ceiling beams on thick iron hooks, were not sides of beef or pork. They were shapes that were horribly, unmistakably human. The match burned his fingers and he dropped it, plunging the room back into darkness. He scrambled to light another, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. The second flame confirmed the horror. He was standing in a human abattoir. He saw a man's torso hung upside down. He saw other, less identifiable parts wrapped in burlap. On the far wall, a series of large salting tubs stood in a row, their purpose now sickeningly clear. In the corner was a deep pit covered with loose boards. He lifted one. The stench that erupted was overwhelming. It was a pit for bones, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them forming a pale, jumbled mass in the darkness. This was not the work of a single, recent murder. This was a system, a process, an enterprise that had been operating for years. This forbidden place was the source of the Blackwood boarding house's famous hospitality. Thomas stumbled back from the bone pit, a scream caught in his throat. He felt as if he were breathing in death itself. His mind struggled to process the scale of the horror. How many men had ended their journeys here? How many unsuspecting travelers had sat at the dining table upstairs, consuming the remains of their predecessors? The entire house, he now realized, was a monument to a carnivorous, predatory evil. He had to get out to show someone, to make the world see what was hidden beneath this quiet, respectable facade. He turned back towards the stairs, his lit match held aloft. As the flame illuminated the stone steps, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the soft mortar between the stones were names. Dozens of them. A. Finch, B. Gable, J. Peterson, W. Sallow. It was a ledger of the dead, a guest book of the damned. He saw the name Billy near the top, freshly carved. Mrs. Blackwood wasn't just a killer, she was an archivist of her own depravity. His mind reeling, he heard a sound from above, a footstep in the kitchen. Then the unmistakable sound of the deadbolt on the cellar door sliding shut. Thump. He was locked in. The match went out, leaving him in absolute, suffocating darkness. He was trapped in a crypt with the victims, the evidence of a lifetime of slaughter. And the monster was upstairs in the kitchen, likely already planning tonight's menu. He was no longer a guest. He was simply the next ingredient. Panic seized him, a primal animal terror that threatened to overwhelm his reason. He was in a subterranean tomb, a larder of human flesh, and the keeper of this macabre pantry had just sealed him inside. He lurched through the darkness, his hands outstretched, until he slammed into the cold, unyielding stone of the foundation. He followed the wall, stumbling over unseen objects, his feet slipping in something wet and viscous on the floor. He made his way back to the stairs and threw himself against the door, pounding his fists against the thick oak, screaming until his throat was raw. "Help! "Somebody help me, let me out." But his cries were swallowed by the stone and earth. He knew it was futile. The house was isolated. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away. No one could hear him. His only audience was the silent, hanging flesh and the bone pit filled with the forgotten. After several minutes his voice gave out, his knuckles raw and bleeding. He slumped onto the steps, his body shaking with a mixture of terror and despair. He was going to die here in the dark. He would become another name scratched into the wall, another meal served on Mrs. Blackwood's fine china. A chilling thought then occurred to him. She hadn't killed him yet. She had simply locked him in. Why? Was she waiting for something? Was she savoring the moment? Or was there a more practical, more horrifying reason? He remembered the salting tubs, the curring hooks. Perhaps her process required the meat to be aged. Perhaps she was just waiting for him to be ready. The thought was more terrifying than a quick death. It was a promise of a slow, deliberate, and entirely profane end. Hours passed. The darkness was total, a physical presence that pressed in on him. He lost all track of time. His mind, in a desperate act of self-preservation, began to shut down the immediate horror, allowing him to think. There had to be a way out. He began a systematic exploration of his prison, using his hands to feel his way through the suffocating blackness. He went back to the walls, running his palms over the cold, damp stone, searching for any weakness, any crack, any other exit. He found nothing but solid, unyielding foundation. He moved to the center of the room, his feet navigating the treacherous floor. He located the butcher's table, the hanging hooks. He flinched as his hand brushed against a cold, stiff form and the bone pit. The pit. An idea, born of sheer desperation, began to form. Cellars in this part of the country, especially old ones, sometimes had drainage tunnels or old coal chutes that had been sealed up. Was it possible there was another opening at the bottom of that pit? It was a horrifying prospect. He would have to climb down into a mass grave, to desecrate the remains of dozens of victims, on the slimmest of chances that he might find an escape. But what other choice did he have? Staying here meant certain death. He took a deep breath, the foul air filling his lungs, and approached the edge of the pit. He used his hands to find the edge, the rough-hewn dirt and rock. He could feel the chilling emptiness below. Steeling himself against the revulsion, he swung his legs over the edge and began to lower himself into the abyss of bone and decay. The historical record on this case is thin, almost non-existent, a testament to how effectively some truths can be buried. But the terror of what Thomas Riley uncovered is a stain that time cannot wash away. The bones shifted and cracked under his weight as he descended into the pit. The sound was obscene, a dry, brittle symphony of the dead. The stench was suffocating, a thick, sweet smell of decay that clung to the back of his throat. He tried not to think about what he was touching, what he was stepping on. He focused only on the wall of the pit, his fingers searching for any irregularity in the packed earth and stone. He moved slowly, deliberately, his feet sinking into the ghastly detritus. He was halfway down when his hand brushed against something that wasn't earth or bone. It was wood, old, rotting wood. He frantically dug at the surrounding dirt, his fingernails tearing. He uncovered the edge of a wooden frame. It was a door, or rather the remnants of one. It was an old coal chute long ago boarded up and buried just as he had hoped. It was his only chance. He pulled at the rotting planks. They were soft, weakened by years of dampness. One splintered in his hands. He pulled harder, his adrenaline surging. A board came loose, then another. He had created a small opening just large enough to squeeze through. A sliver of fresh, clean air, the most beautiful thing he had ever smelled, drifted in, a stark contrast to the foul atmosphere of the pit. He didn't hesitate. He pushed himself through the small opening, the jagged wood tearing at his clothes and skin, and tumbled out onto a bed of damp leaves on the other side. He was outside. He was free. He had emerged into the dense woods behind the house, hidden from view by a thicket of overgrown bushes. He scrambled to his feet, not daring to look back, and ran. He ran blindly, crashing through the undergrowth, fueled by a terror so profound it erased all thought of pain or exhaustion. He just ran, away from the house of flesh, away from the Macabre chef and her forbidden kitchen. Thomas didn't stop running until the woods gave way to the main road and the first houses on the outskirts of Havenwood came into view. He was a terrifying sight, covered in dirt and grave dust, his clothes torn, his face pale with horror, his hands bloody. He burst into Sheriff Brody's office for the second time, his wild-eyed appearance and panicked babbling a stark contrast to his calm demeanor just days before. This time, Brody couldn't dismiss him. The physical evidence of his ordeal was written all over him. "The cellar bones she locked me in," Thomas gasped, collapsing into a chair. He told Brody everything he had seen: the hanging bodies, the butcher's table, the bone pit, the names carved into the wall. He spoke of the coal chute, his desperate escape. His testimony was disjointed, hysterical, but it was filled with the undeniable ring of truth. The cufflink had been circumstantial. This was something else entirely. This was a direct, horrifying accusation that could no longer be ignored. Sheriff Brody's face, usually a mask of lazy indifference, slowly hardened into a look of disbelief, then dawning horror. He had known Elspeth Blackwood his entire life. He had eaten at her table dozens of times. The implications of what Thomas was saying were monstrous, unthinkable. But the state of the man in front of him was undeniable proof that something terrible had happened at that boarding house. Brody grabbed his shotgun from the wall and deputized 2 men from the general store across the street. A small, grim-faced posse was formed. Their destination, the Blackwood boarding house. This time they would not be knocking on the front door. This time they were coming for answers. The quiet, sleepy town of Havenwood was about to have its deepest, darkest secret torn violently into the light. The walk to the boarding house was tense and silent. The 2 deputized townsmen, ordinary farmers who had likely shared pleasantries with Mrs. Blackwood just days before, clutched their hunting rifles with white knuckles. Sheriff Brody led the way, his face a grim stone mask. As they approached the house, everything appeared normal. The flowers were still pristine in their beds. A light shone from the kitchen window. There was no sign of violence, no hint of the charnel house that Thomas described lay beneath their feet. They surrounded the house. Brody took the front while the other 2 covered the back. On the sheriff's signal, he kicked the front door open. It flew inward with a splintering crash. "Elspeth Blackwood," Brody yelled, his voice echoing through the silent house. "This is the sheriff. Come out with your hands up." There was no answer, only the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. They moved through the downstairs rooms, room by room. The parlor was neat. The dining room table was set for the next meal. In the kitchen, a pot of soup was simmering on the stove, filling the air with a savory aroma that now seemed utterly grotesque. But the house was empty. Elspeth Blackwood was gone. She had vanished. They found the hallway leading to the cellar. The heavy oak door was now ajar, a dark, gaping maw leading into the earth. Brody and his men descended the stairs, their lanterns cutting through the oppressive darkness. And then they saw it. They saw exactly what Thomas had described. The scene was a tableau of industrial-scale murder, a hellish vision of hooks, blades, and dismembered bodies. One of the deputies retched violently in the corner. Sheriff Brody simply stared, his face ashen, the full, horrifying reality of what Elspeth Blackwood was, and what she had been serving to this town for years, crashing down upon him. The discovery in the cellar sent a shockwave through Havenwood. The town's carefully constructed reality was shattered. The woman they had known as a pious widow, a kindly neighbor, and a gifted cook was, in fact, a monster. A prolific serial killer who had turned cannibalism into a cottage industry. The boarding house was cordoned off, becoming a site of grim pilgrimage for the morbidly curious, who stood at a distance and stared in horrified silence. State authorities were called in, but the investigation was hampered by the era's limited forensic capabilities. They could confirm the remains were human, and that they belonged to numerous individuals, but identifying the victims was nearly impossible. They were transient men, drifters with few family ties and no one to report them missing. They had simply been erased, their existence reduced to a name scratched in a cellar wall and a contribution to Elspeth Blackwood's legendary stew. The bone pit was excavated. The sheer volume of remains suggested a reign of terror that had lasted not for years, but for decades. The investigators estimated there could be as many as 40 or 50 victims, perhaps more. The town was forced to confront a horrifying truth. For as long as anyone could remember, the Blackwood boarding house had been a trap, and its meals had been flesh. Every church picnic she had catered, every plate of food she had given to a neighbor, was now tainted by this macabre revelation. The very memory of her hospitality had become a curse. What is truly disturbing is how such evil can flourish in plain sight, hidden behind a mask of normalcy. If you appreciate stories that peel back that mask, consider supporting our channel by liking this video and sharing it. It helps us continue to bring these forbidden histories out of the shadows. A massive manhunt was launched for Elspeth Blackwood, but it was as if she had been swallowed by the earth. She had a small head start, and she used it to perfection. No one saw her leave town. The horse and buggy from her stable were missing, but the trail went cold just a few miles outside of Havenwood. It was speculated that she had boarded a train in a neighboring county, or perhaps had a secluded cabin hidden deep in the Ozark wilderness where she could live out her days. There were dozens of reported sightings of her over the next few years, in Missouri, in Louisiana, even as far west as Texas. An old woman matching her description, running a small diner or working as a cook for a ranch. Each lead was investigated, but none ever resulted in her capture. Elspeth Blackwood had become a ghost, a boogeyman whispered about in the dark. She left behind almost nothing of her personal life. Investigators searched her living quarters, hoping to find a journal, a diary, anything that might explain her monstrous compulsion. They found nothing. Her past was a blank slate. She had arrived in Havenwood some 30 years prior with her husband, who died of a sudden illness a few years later. She had been the quiet, unassuming widow ever since. There was no clue as to what had twisted her into a killer, no explanation for her forbidden appetite. Was she born a monster, or was she made one? The absence of a motive made her crimes even more terrifying. Her evil was a force of nature, inexplicable and absolute, a cold case that offered no closure, only the horrifying fact of what she had done. In the aftermath, the town of Havenwood turned on itself. How could this have happened? How could they have not known? The guilt was a palpable poison. People began to remember things, strange smells from her chimney at odd hours, the surprising number of men who checked into her boarding house but were never seen checking out. They had all dismissed these oddities, blinded by her reputation and their own unwillingness to look too closely. Sheriff Brody faced the harshest criticism. He had been warned by Thomas Riley, and he had done nothing. His failure to act had allowed the horror to continue and almost cost Thomas his life. Brody became a pariah, a living symbol of the town's willful ignorance. He resigned from his position a few months later and moved away, unable to bear the weight of the town's silent condemnation. The Blackwood boarding house itself became a cursed place. No one dared to enter it. It stood empty and silent, a monument to the town's shame. Children would dare each other to run up and touch the porch, and parents would tell stories of the butcher of Havenwood to scare their children into behaving. The house was a festering wound on the landscape, a constant reminder of the darkness that had lived in their midst. Finally, about a year after the discovery, a group of townspeople took matters into their own hands. In the dead of night, they set it ablaze. They watched as the flames consumed the structure, hoping to purge the evil from their town, to burn away the memories. But some things cannot be erased by fire. Some stories become legends, and the macabre tale of the boarding house where every meal was flesh was now permanently etched into the soul of Havenwood. And what of Thomas Riley, the man who uncovered the horror? He left Havenwood immediately after giving his testimony and never returned. The story he had stumbled upon was too gruesome, too disturbing to be turned into the kind of fiction he was used to writing. It was a truth stranger and more terrifying than any penny dreadful. He reportedly suffered from severe psychological trauma for the rest of his life, plagued by nightmares of his time in the cellar. He abandoned his career as a writer, unable to face the blank page without seeing the horrors he had witnessed. He lived a quiet, reclusive life, forever haunted by the taste of Mrs. Blackwood's cooking and the sound of her cleaver in the night. The story itself was largely suppressed. In an era that valued propriety and progress, the tale of a cannibalistic landlady in rural Arkansas was a stain on the state's reputation. Official records are scarce. Newspaper accounts from the time are brief and understated, referring only to the discovery of unidentified remains and the flight of a person of interest. The true, horrifying details were deemed too disturbing for public consumption. The story was banned from polite conversation, pushed into the realm of forbidden folklore. It became a whispered legend, a ghost story told around campfires, its facts blurring with fiction over the decades until it was almost forgotten entirely. It became a cold case not just for law enforcement, but for history itself, an account of profound evil that was deliberately left to rot in the cellar of the past. Let us pause and consider the psychology of Elspeth Blackwood. Without a confession, without a journal, we are left to speculate on the nature of her evil. What could possibly motivate a woman to commit such sustained, systematic atrocities? Some theories at the time pointed towards a simple, brutal pragmatism. In an isolated town, meat could be expensive and difficult to procure. Her boarders, transient and anonymous, were a readily available, free-of-charge resource. This theory paints her as a monster of pure, cold-blooded efficiency, a businesswoman who streamlined her operation in the most horrifying way imaginable. Perhaps her apathetic view of her fellow humans allowed her to see them not as people but as livestock. This is the logic of the predator, devoid of empathy, driven only by a fundamental need. She provided a service, room and board, and in her twisted mind, the boarders provided a service in return. It was a closed, sustainable, and utterly macabre ecosystem she had created within the walls of her house. This explanation, however, feels incomplete. It accounts for the act but not the ritual. It doesn't explain the meticulousness, the pride she took in her cooking, the carving of the names into the cellar wall. That suggests something deeper, something more personal. A purely pragmatic killer would seek to dispose of all evidence, not to archive it. The names on the wall were not a record, they were trophies. Another darker theory delves into the realm of the truly psychological. Perhaps Elspeth Blackwood was not driven by pragmatism, but by a profound, all-consuming misanthropy, a deep-seated hatred for mankind. Specifically, for the kind of men who passed through her doors. The drifters, the salesmen, the loggers, men who were untethered, often crude and lonely. Perhaps her husband, whose death was recorded as a sudden illness, was actually her first victim. Maybe his death unlocked something within her, a taste for a specific kind of power and control. In her kitchen, she was the absolute master. She had the power of life and death. She could transform these men, whom she perhaps saw as base and unworthy, into something to be consumed, to be literally and figuratively subjugated. The act of cooking and serving them to other men could have been a form of supreme, cosmic joke, a private ritual of contempt. It was an expression of ultimate power. She wasn't just feeding people. She was feeding them their own kind, turning them into unwitting cannibals, making them complicit in her sin. From this perspective, the boarding house was not a business. It was a temple, and she was its high priestess, performing a daily, unholy sacrament. Each meal was an act of vengeance, each satisfied customer a testament to her horrifying, secret power. This disturbing possibility recasts her from a simple predator into something far more ideologically monstrous. There is also the possibility of a supernatural or folkloric influence, a thread that was often whispered among the more superstitious residents of the Ozarks. The region is rich with tales of dark entities and ancient curses. Some stories that emerged after the fact claimed that Elspeth Blackwood wasn't just a killer, but that she was beholden to something older and darker. They spoke of the land the boarding house was built on, suggesting it was a place of bad energy, a cursed ground that warped the souls of those who lived there too long. These tales hinted that her culinary habits were not her own invention, but a continuation of a forbidden tradition, a ritual to appease some hungry, malevolent spirit that resided in the earth beneath the cellar. This explanation, of course, steps outside the bounds of rational analysis and into the realm of the macabre and the fantastic. Yet it speaks to the human need to find a reason for the unreasonable. The idea that a woman could simply choose to do such things is, in some ways, more terrifying than the idea that she was compelled by some external, evil force. The concept of a curse provides a framework for understanding an evil that otherwise defies comprehension. It turns a story of human depravity into a ghost story, making it safer, more distant. But the horrifying truth is that the only monster proven to exist in the Blackwood boarding house was a human one. No demon or spirit was ever found, only the chilling evidence of Elspeth Blackwood's own handiwork. The legacy of the fire that destroyed the boarding house was not one of cleansing, but of confirmation. For decades afterward, the empty lot where the house once stood remained barren. Locals claimed that the soil was poisoned, that nothing would grow there. The land was said to be permanently stained by the atrocities committed upon it. People who walked by the lot at night reported strange phenomena: the faint smell of cooking meat on the air, the disembodied sound of a woman humming a hymn, or the chilling, rhythmic scrape of a blade on a whetstone. These were likely just stories, the projections of a community's collective trauma, but they served a purpose. They kept the memory alive, turning the site into a place of local legend, a physical manifestation of the town's dark secret. The story of Elspeth Blackwood became a cautionary tale, a brutal lesson in the duality of human nature. It served as a reminder that the most welcoming smiles can hide the most monstrous intentions, and that the most comforting hospitality can be a carefully laid trap. The empty lot was a scar on the town, a void that spoke more loudly than any standing monument could. It represented the absence of justice for the victims, the absence of answers, and the terrifying absence of Elspeth Blackwood herself, a killer who had melted back into the world, potentially to begin her horrifying work anew in some other unsuspecting town. The very ground had become a cold case file. The most disturbing question left unanswered is not what happened to Elspeth Blackwood, but whether she acted alone. The sheer scale of her operation is staggering to contemplate for a single, aging woman. The process of dispatching a man, dismembering a body, processing the meat, and disposing of the bones is an arduous, physically demanding task. Could one woman have done this, week after week, for decades, without any age? And without anyone in a town this small noticing? It seems almost impossible. This has led to speculation that she had an accomplice. Perhaps one of the long-term boarders, someone who seemed as quiet and unassuming as she was secretly her partner in crime. Or maybe someone in town, a butcher, a doctor, or even a lawman, was involved, helping her procure victims or dispose of evidence in exchange for a share of the profits or for some other, darker reason. Sheriff Brody's initial, almost aggressive refusal to investigate could be seen in a more sinister light. Was it just the laziness of a complacent official, or was he actively trying to protect her? Was his dismissal of Thomas a deliberate act of obstruction? This possibility casts an even wider net of darkness over the entire town of Havenwood, suggesting that the evil was not confined to one house, but was a conspiracy of silence or even active participation. The idea that a network of depravity existed, hidden beneath the surface of small-town life, is a deeply unsettling thought. It suggests that Elspeth was not an anomaly, but merely the most visible part of a larger, more horrifying machine. Let's re-examine the victims. They were chosen with a chilling degree of care. They were all men. They were all travelers. They were all alone. They were, in the parlance of the time, drifters, people whose absence would not be immediately noticed, whose disappearance would not trigger a frantic search by a loving family. Elspeth Blackwood exploited a crack in society. She preyed on the lonely, the transient, the invisible. These men came to her seeking a temporary home, a brief respite from a hard life on the road. They found a moment of comfort, a warm bed, and a delicious meal. There is a profound and cruel irony in the fact that their final moments of comfort were provided by their executioner. She was likely the last friendly face they ever saw. Her kindness was the bait in her trap. She offered them a sense of belonging, only to consume them, literally absorbing them into the fabric of her horrifying domestic world. The list of names in the cellar was the only testament left to their existence. Without Thomas Riley's accidental discovery, these men would have remained missing forever, their fates unknown, their disappearances attributed to the thousand natural hazards of a transient life. They would have simply vanished. Elspeth Blackwood's true genius was not in her cooking, but in her understanding of human anonymity. She knew who to kill because she knew who the world would never miss. And that is perhaps the most macabre part of this entire story. The tale of Elspeth Blackwood and her boarding house of flesh exists in a liminal space between fact and folklore. The historical record is too thin to provide concrete answers, leaving us with a narrative built from local legend, second-hand accounts, and the horrified testimony of one man who survived. Is it possible the story has been exaggerated over time? Of course. Ghost stories have a tendency to grow more elaborate with each telling. The number of victims, the gruesome details of the cellar, these elements may have been embellished by the passage of years. But the core of the story, the central, horrifying truth, remains. Something terrible happened in that house. A woman named Elspeth Blackwood fed people to people. The cufflink of A.F., the terror of Thomas Riley, the bone pit discovered by Sheriff Brody. These are the anchors of fact in a sea of legend. It is a story that has been pushed to the fringes of history because it is too disturbing to contemplate as reality. We prefer to believe that monsters like Elspeth Blackwood belong in fiction. But history is filled with forbidden chapters and banned stories that prove, time and again, that the most terrifying monsters are real. They walk among us, they smile at us, and sometimes they even invite us in for dinner. The story of the Blackwood boarding house is a chilling reminder that the veneer of civilization is terrifyingly thin. So what can we take away from this disturbing, half-forgotten case? It is a story about the darkness that can hide in plain sight, the profound evil that can fester behind a veneer of respectability. Elspeth Blackwood was not a cackling villain from a Gothic novel. She was, by all outward appearances, a kind, gentle, God-fearing woman. Her evil was not theatrical, it was domestic. It was woven into the daily rituals of her life, of cooking, of cleaning, of tending her garden. And that is what makes it so profoundly unsettling. The story also serves as a stark reminder of how easily people can disappear, especially those who live on the margins of society. The victims of the Blackwood boarding house were not important men. They had no power, no wealth, no influential families to demand justice for them. They were invisible in life, and in death, they were erased. Their only memorial was a name scratched in a cellar wall. L and the horrified memory of the man who found them. It is a cold case in the truest sense of the word. The perpetrator was never caught. The full number of victims was never known. The motive remains a matter of dark speculation. All that is left is the story, a chilling, macabre piece of American folklore that reminds us of the horrifying possibilities that lie just beneath the surface of the mundane world. Tonight, when you sit down for your evening meal, this story might just linger in the back of your mind. It's a tale that worms its way into your subconscious, tainting the simple, comforting act of eating with a shadow of macabre possibility. The legacy of Elspeth Blackwood is not one of a name in a history book, but of a lingering, primal fear. It's the fear of the unknown, the fear of misplaced trust, and the terrifying realization that you can never truly know the secrets another person keeps. Elspeth Blackwood vanished into the mists of history, leaving behind a legend and a long list of unanswered questions. Did she die in obscurity, an old woman with a dark secret? Or did she find another quiet, unsuspecting town, change her name, and open another quaint little boarding house, hanging out a sign that promised a hot meal and a soft bed? Could it be that somewhere else, in some other forgotten corner of the country, there is another cellar, another bone pit, another list of names scratched into a wall? The truth is, we will never know. She became a part of the forbidden American mythology, the kindly old woman who was really a monster, the perfect hostess who served her guests to other guests. She remains forever at large, a ghost in the annals of crime, a chilling testament to an evil so profound, it was nearly erased from history altogether.